Welcome to another virtual panel discussion of the Centre for Geopolitics at the University of Cambridge. Today we are joined by an esteemed panel to discuss the place for responsibility to protect in ensuring the human rights protections of Indigenous peoples. I am Tom Peake, Research Associate at the Centre for Geopolitics at the University of Cambridge, and I'm joined today by Nadia Rubai, Co-Director of the Institute for Genocide and Mass Atrocity Prevention at Binghamton University, India Reid Bowers, Founder and Director of the International Organization for Self-Determination and Equality, and Karine Duhamel, Research Curator at the Canadian Museum of Human Rights. And welcome also to our truly global audience. Thank you very much for joining us. And please do feel free to submit any questions you have to our panel. Just click the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen and type it in, and we will channel it through to our panelists. And please do note if your question is directed to a specific panelist or to the panel in general. And also please do leave your name and your university or other affiliation, institutional affiliation, should you have one. Now, to begin, I will invite each of our speakers to say a few words, beginning with Nadia Rubai.
Thank you, Thomas, and thank you to the Center for Geopolitics for the invitation to participate in this panel. I am honored to share the stage, or the screen, if you will, with Karine Duhamel and India Reid Bowers. Let me begin by acknowledging that I'm speaking from my home in Ithaca, New York, which sits on the ancestral lands of the Haudenosaunee, the peoples who are more commonly referred to as the Iroquois, and more specifically on the lands of the Cayuga peoples. We're here today to talk about the responsibility to protect in relationship to Indigenous people. R2P has as its core commitment, a commitment from each state to protect its own population from mass atrocities. Among the most vulnerable minority groups exposed to historical and ongoing human rights abuses are Indigenous peoples. In preparing for this panel, Thomas suggested that we consider two questions. How well does R2P function as a mechanism for protecting Indigenous peoples? And how does the state-centric focus of R2P take into account the formal rights of autonomy and self-determination held by many Indigenous peoples? The short answer to both questions is that R2P doesn't do a very good job at either. I'd like to highlight three interrelated characteristics of the systems that have been designed to protect groups from mass atrocities and the ways in which we conceptualize atrocity prevention that are inherently problematic in the context of Indigenous peoples. I apologize in advance for presenting a largely pessimistic assessment in my opening remarks. I do see some positive signs or opportunities, and I'll mention them in the discussion and responses to questions after everyone speaks. So I'll start by talking explicitly about R2P, since that's the focus of this series of panel discussions organized by the Center for Geopolitics. R2P certainly is not to blame for the ongoing atrocities that Indigenous peoples suffer, but because of the way it's framed, those states that fail to meet their Pillar 1 obligations with respect to Indigenous peoples are unlikely to receive much international pressure under Pillars 2 or 3. On previous panels in this series, speakers have, not surprisingly, made references to state sovereignty as a ubiquitous obstacle to realizing the full potential of R2P. In an oversimplified summary of the way Edward Luck of the International Peace Institute describes it, states are strategic actors and many are risk averse. They are hesitant to encroach on another state's sovereignty for fear that at some future time, that state or others will encroach on their own. As such, it's easy to understand how a country that's presently understood to be perpetrating mass atrocities, think Myanmar, Syria, or the DRC, might balk at leading or being part of an R2P-driven intervention in another country. But what about the rest of the world? R2P is founded on the underlying assumption that the majority, perhaps the vast majority, of countries which comprise the community of nations will uphold their Pillar 1 responsibilities and will not be engaged in mass atrocities against their own populations. And thus they should be willing to uphold Pillars 2 and 3 to ensure that other countries do the same. Now stop for a moment and consider that many modern nation states across multiple continents are characterized by histories of atrocities against their Indigenous populations. Scanning the list of places for which the UN Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples has issued country reports is like taking a comprehensive world tour. In addition to extending the full length of the Americas, including Canada, the US, Mexico, several countries in Central America, extending down through South America to Brazil, Chile, and Argentina, and many in between, the list also includes countries ranging from Australia and New Zealand to the Sapmi region that encompasses parts of Norway, Sweden, Finland, and Russia, from France to Congo, from Namibia to East Timor, from Botswana and South Africa to Nepal, and the list goes on. And these are only the places that agreed to allow a special rapporteur to visit. For countries in Asia that would not allow a visit, gathering information was limited to a regional consultation held in Malaysia that included representatives of indigenous peoples from 11 countries in the region. In all of these countries, as well as others not listed, R2P is fatally flawed as a tool for protecting indigenous peoples. In many, if not all of these countries, not only have they committed atrocities against indigenous peoples in the past, most often as part of invasion and colonization, but they continue to do so, albeit in different ways than in the past. They may no longer be slaughtering indigenous people outright or stealing and brainwashing their children, but the legacies of past actions remain, for the children forcibly removed from the families and schooled to remove their indigenous beliefs. And many continue to actively destroy indigenous ways of life through, among other things, mineral extraction, which poisons the air and water on which indigenous people depend, deforestation of their lands to accommodate construction and agricultural projects, killing or disappearing of indigenous human rights defenders, and violating rights to remain in voluntary isolation. That is, many states are not fulfilling their Pillar 1 obligations to protect their own indigenous populations. If we start from understanding that, it should come as no surprise the reluctance to fulfill responsibilities under Pillars 2 or 3, particularly when atrocities are being directed at indigenous peoples. Might this explain why we had to wait for the Gambia to raise its voice regarding the Rohingya in Myanmar, despite so much evidence available to the entire world? Might this explain why the world has largely stood by, why Brazil's government has dramatically accelerated the so-called development of the Amazon at the expense of indigenous people there? The second issue is that R2P doesn't operate in a vacuum, and it's not the only international institution that uses a state-centric focus. We have numerous international documents declaring that indigenous peoples have autonomy and the right of self-determination, which implies some level of sovereignty. But in practice, indigenous people do not have full standing in sovereign states, and that limits their abilities to be protected from atrocity crimes. We don't have time to examine the full range of institutions, so let me just take a quick look at how two international judicial bodies that serve important roles in atrocity prevention also perpetuate the status quo with respect to violations of indigenous rights. As the principal judicial organ of the UN, the International Court of Justice has the authority to settle disputes between countries and to resolve disputes regarding treaties, including the Genocide Convention. The ICJ has inherent limitations based on its reliance on the principle of consent that I won't get into here, but it has additional limitations in the context of indigenous peoples because it only allows states to be parties to cases or make formal charges. So indigenous people cannot initiate such proceedings or dispute how treaties are or are not being met. The International Criminal Court has the authority to investigate and punish atrocity crimes. And the definitions of genocide and crimes against humanity under the Rome Statute and as applied by the ICC in other contexts cover a lot of ground where indigenous people are concerned. In fact, groups have presented information on behalf of indigenous peoples to the ICC's Office of the Prosecutor related to such crimes. We don't yet have a case or a specific ruling on indigenous peoples. How do we understand that? Well, one possible reason might be that the ICC punishes people, not states, and as such, it's better suited to respond to blatant acts of commission in the form of mass killings or explicit incitement to genocide, concentrated in time and place. It's less equipped to handle the more insidious acts of omission associated with institutional or systemic discrimination or slower processes of destruction that many indigenous people face. A third challenge we have to address as scholars and practitioners if we want to engage in more effective prevention relates to how we conceptualize the stages of atrocity and of atrocity prevention. Whether we use Gregory Stanton's 10 Stages of Genocide, Irvin Staub's Continuum of Destruction, or James Waller's image of a stream flowing through up, mid, and downstream stages, a common characteristic of these models is that they identify different strategies for prevention and corresponding actors for different stages of the process. I'll use the terminology of Waller's model because it's more concise and easier to discuss. Obviously, these are absolutely essential frameworks, not only because they challenge the simplistic notions of mass atrocities as sudden events caused by single bad actors, but also because they encourage recognition of early warning signs, and they place greater emphasis on engaging in more upstream and domestically focused prevention efforts that could support Pillar 1 of R2P. But the models are also problematic in the case of Indigenous populations. This is because the prevention strategies advocated and the actors responsible for prevention vary based on the stage. But for many Indigenous people, they are simultaneously at all three stages. When we focus on one stage or another without responding to all three simultaneously and in a holistic way, we may be unintentionally exacerbating other stages. Thus, if we push for memorials or transitional justice for seemingly past atrocities, and we fail to acknowledge that the atrocities continue, those downstream efforts will seem hollow and insincere. If the state designs and promotes upstream strategies, perhaps through educational programs, without having provided apologies or reparations for past atrocities, or without having stopped the ongoing atrocities, the well-intentioned upstream efforts may in fact perpetuate the very structures which allowed or encouraged the atrocities to begin with. So I've mentioned three big issues that make atrocity prevention particularly challenging for Indigenous peoples. Widespread experience of atrocities against Indigenous peoples, which heighten the perceptions of threats to state sovereignty within R2P, the state-centric structure of international judicial bodies, and the pairing of prevention strategies to stages of the process without a consideration for those concurrently in all stages. I could go on, but I've used up my time, so I'll stop with those three observations and save other remarks for later. Thank you.
Many thanks, and now we turn to India Reed-Bowers.
Hi. Thank you everyone for this opportunity, and I will acknowledge that I am in Sweden and on the lands, the traditional lands of the Sami people. And I am going to be talking about sort of a decolonizing approach to R2P and different ways that we can look at this and some root causes of some of the issues. So just a little background, IOSDE has ongoing confidential projects and cases with Indigenous peoples in, for example, rights to and creation of self-governance and autonomy, historic redress, self-determined truthing processes, restorative redress, centering with and for at-risk victims and survivors, self-determined systems, and also public collaborations. And the approach includes partnering with clients as their own knowledge keepers and experts with own traditions, treating violations as of especially vulnerable peoples and also women's rights as indicators of larger systemic and systems violations and imbalances to be pinpointed, rooted, analyzed, and addressed, and intervening where those at risk cannot. So some of the works can be seen on the website and some are confidential. I'm going to start with a sample intervention, IOC intervention that I did at one of the UN mechanisms for Indigenous peoples, the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, and then there's also the Expert Mechanism on Indigenous Rights, MRIP, Indigenous peoples. So this was at the 14th session. And one portion goes, IOSDE is concerned that over the many years of submissions and interventions at the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues from Indigenous peoples concerning mass atrocities against their peoples, families, and communities, and thus humanity through state and business-initiated torture, murder, militarization, criminalization, and systematic devastation, the Permanent Forum and UN systems still refer to such horrors as human rights violations only. The concern is that Indigenous victims' submissions are not being outwardly identified as reporting atrocities, also in the context of international crimes and violations of international criminal law from a legal and/or victim-based advocacy perspective and analysis. I'm concerned by the lack of presence, analysis, accessibility to, and participation at the Permanent Forum and all other UN Indigenous events, procedures, and mechanisms of the UN agency of the Office of the Special Advisors of the Prevention of Genocide and on their responsibility to protect. So now I'm going to look into a little bit of how this came to be. The responsibility to protect can serve both structurally and in action as either beneficial or harmful to the persons and peoples it is meant to prevent atrocities against. In practice, it can arise from and/or result in, for example, paternalism and control, which is perpetuating harm or the very atrocities meant to be prevented, and shifting in between universal allyship, rights fulfillment, and prevention, which is good practice. Without Indigenous peoples' genuine political equality and due economics and actualization of Indigenous rights, R2P becomes a feedback loop of the very abuse it is meant to address. Protecting the rights to self-determination, autonomy, as well as prevention universally against genocide and atrocities as allyship at all levels is good practice. R2P as shared responsibility and activity with Indigenous peoples by all is good practice. This must include free, prior, informed consent, and especially respect to the intellectual property of victims and survivors. So roadblocks to R2P for Indigenous peoples as a functioning concept or process include, historically speaking, and still predetermined, not self-determined decolonization. Indigenous peoples were excluded from the UN decolonization process and therefore never underwent the process of restructuring the relationship with the colonizing state and having own governance that's recognized in that way. And this, of course, leads to all kinds of other situations, such as not having access to signing treaties on equal footing or participate in creation of legal codification, such as, international criminal law or procedures, etc. So it's a form of discrimination and segregation. Structural loopholes of the United Nations mechanisms designed to engage and include Indigenous peoples in issues result in segregating Indigenous peoples from access to fair and equal participation, which is a part of what I just talked about. Criminalization and militarization of the territories of Indigenous peoples who identify as such, who are seeking, especially who are seeking autonomy or self-determination. Usually this is strategic and connected to, on the part of the violator, connected to land or resource grabbing. And the issue is especially present in the context of recognition versus non-recognition, or Indigenous peoples who are criminalized even for identifying as Indigenous, which is an issue that I've worked on with people through IOSD. And then also the issue of state-imposed identity. And this goes into not being able to identify as Indigenous or the name of the people, and having to identify only as minority as opposed to by then state, etc., which leads to a whole host of other problems. This is a bad example of creating the problems that R2P is supposed to solve. So political will is a big issue. States party to R2P commitments therein have not taken up the issues of real and ongoing situations of genocide atrocities against Indigenous peoples proportionately to the crimes being reported into the Indigenous peoples mechanisms of the UN, even in my opinion analysis, as mentioned. In my work, I also draw parallels regarding domestic violence and partnership, rape, abuse, violence, etc., versus mutual respect and equality in technical, social, structural, relational aspects and power dynamics regarding states, businesses, Indigenous peoples. And R2P in decolonized equality contexts can be non-state centered. It should also be in effect that Indigenous peoples can sign what have to date been state-only treaties, have responsibilities to human rights and international human rights and criminal law treaties, create own treaties, negotiate the contents, etc. This is especially important also for those seeking change or justice within their own communities. A comparative example regarding the essence of self-determination among many comparative examples to think about is that states respect each other's sovereignty in theory, and decisions to be a part of the ebb and flow by design of global and regional territorial politics when acting in good faith. For example, the formation of the European Union, as well as the eventual and recent and controversial UK separation from the EU, which is an ebb and flow of political and political territorial design. The fact that Indigenous peoples cannot freely do the same, and especially as a colonized peoples, and especially as the settler state, lack of redress involving settler states, is the result of prejudices and biases based in historical and thus ongoing colonialism and notions of the right to conquest. This is something we've also worked on. In good practice, R2P states return what has been stolen. The international laws, needs, and knowledge exist to reach the critical goals of reversing the genocidal and atrocities trends in the world, especially for Indigenous peoples. R2P in a decolonized, equality-based form in favor of restoring Indigenous practices can serve as a necessary good practice in atrocities prevention as globally shared mutual R2P among all people and governances, while also serving as a tool of urgent action. R2P meaning and good practice then regarding Indigenous peoples, given the historical and ongoing context of colonialism, is also a matter of goodwill and good faith applied actively to manifest good practice, centering victims and survivors' own voices, designs, needs, and true and tangible access to implementation and change. This should be considered the responsibility of everyone. The work that IOSD does and that I do, whether it's through IOSD or as an independent collaborator, consultant, among other things, works to correct these gaps and make these changes. So, and you can see more on the website of some of the projects, and maybe more will come up in discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And finally, before we begin taking questions from the floor, and just a reminder to the audience, please do send any questions you have in through the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, and don't forget to mention if your question is directed to a specific panelist or to the panel in general, and also please do leave your name and university or other institutional affiliation should you have one. Before we get to our questions, please, Karine Duhamel.
Hi, I'm so happy to be here. I'm talking to you today from Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada, which is Treaty 1 territory and also the homeland of the Métis Nation. It's also the ancestral lands of the Ojibwe, Cree, the Dakota, and the Dene, and the Assiniboine. I myself myself am Anishinabe Metis. I was born here and I've found my way back here again after several years away. And I'm really happy to be part of this panel and happy to be talking to you today about a bit of a case study that I think really embodies a lot of the things that Nadia and India already talked about. And so in Canada, for those of you who do not know, Indigenous women are 12 times more likely to be murdered or missing than any other women in Canada, and 16 times more likely to be murdered or go missing than Caucasian women. As more and more studies show on violence, Indigenous women, girls, and two-spirited people are being targeted from all sides, from partners and family members, acquaintances, and serial killers. Rates of domestic and family violence are extremely high, but so is stranger violence. Indigenous women are also more likely to be killed by acquaintances than non-Indigenous women, and are 7 times as likely to be targeted by serial killers. People have called this rate of violence an epidemic, and I'm going to talk to you today about a project that I've been involved in. I am a curator now, but last year around this time, I was just finishing up working on a very historic national project, which is the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. It began its work in the fall of 2016 after the appointment of commissioners and the creation of terms of reference. And while the National Inquiry was in part a product of a call to action from a different Truth Commission in Canada, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, it was also the fruit of decades of advocacy on behalf of MMIWG families. Indigenous women, girls, and two-spirited people in Canada have been targets of violence for far too long. This truth is undeniable. The fact that the National Inquiry was formed in 2016 doesn't mean that Indigenous people waited this long to speak up. It means that it took Canada that long to listen. The National Inquiry's mandate was really vast, and I know that we don't have a ton of time, but just very briefly, to give you a sense of it, we were asked to investigate and report on the systemic causes of all forms of violence against Indigenous women and girls, including sexual violence. We're also called to examine the underlying social, economic, cultural, institutional, and historical causes that contribute to the ongoing violence and vulnerabilities of Indigenous women and girls in Canada. And our mandate also directed us to investigate and report on existing institutional policies and practices to address violence, including those that are effective in reducing violence and increasing safety. You can tell from that brief summary, our mandate was essentially unlimited in the sense that there was no sort of time frame, there was no limit, and it really was about all forms of violence. We also really chose to broaden our mandate to include what we called families of the heart, that is to say people that were not necessarily biologically related to someone who had been murdered or who had gone missing, but who were part of that person's family of the heart, and also to extend our mandate to two-spirited and transgendered people. More than 2,400 people participated in the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls, for which I served as Director of Research, also Director of the Forensic Document Review Project and of the Legacy Archives. People could come forward and could testify in a public hearing. They could testify in a private statement. They could testify before one or more commissioners in sort of a field setting, and they could also submit their truth through an artistic expression. We also heard from almost 100 different expert witnesses, elders and knowledge keepers, frontline workers, and also government officials who provided some testimony in 9 different institutional and expert and knowledge keeper hearings. The truth collectively shared in the National Inquiry hearings tell the story, or more accurately, thousands of stories of acts of genocide against Indigenous women, girls, and two-spirited people. As we found, and notably as the Government of Canada has accepted, the violence of the National Inquiry heard amounts to a race-based genocide of Indigenous peoples, including First Nations, Inuit, and Métis, which especially targets women, girls, and two-spirited people. This genocide has been empowered by colonial structures, evidenced notably by the Indian Act, which still exists in Canada, the 60s swoop, residential schools, and grievous breaches of human and Indigenous rights that have led directly to the current increased rates of violence, death, and suicide in Indigenous populations. The opportunities and the limitations of the inquiry process in Canada were evident from the start, but for those who worked within it, the National Inquiry's terms of reference and indeed its mandate represented an invitation and an opportunity to pursue indigenized methodologies and ways of finding truth as a stretching of these processes themselves. This process led us as a team to very frank discussions about how we know what we know and how best to center the voices of the survivors and the family members who came forward to tell their stories. Within this work, we looked really deliberately to counter the narratives imposed upon Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirited people by state actors and agencies, vigorously defending their efforts to protect. In Canada, the state tells itself a very different story that you will hear in community and from family members and survivors. And Indigenous people are often blamed themselves for the violence they face. In news media and in many other sort of government frameworks, Indigenous women are often to blame for the violence against them because they engage in so-called high-risk lifestyles. In addition, state agencies have worked hard to really reify a deficit-based analysis of violence that absolves the state in large part from its responsibility to protect. I have many examples that I could share, but I have not a lot of time, and so please I'll come back to that in the Q&A. I'll try to include a couple of examples, but essentially the way that they report about their responsibility to protect really provides a basis for policymakers not to act, and these were the ideas against which we positioned our research and our work for the National Inquiry. Ultimately, as it relates to the responsibility to protect, we were able to distance ourselves from the idea as exclusively Western and state-centric by relying on the testimonies of thousands of people who came forward to articulate what R2P looks like in Indigenous terms and in Indigenous communities. Key findings in this area include a need to understand R2P from a distinctions-based and decolonized framework that accounts for differences among Indigenous groups in Canada and that centers relationships at its core. It also reveals the extent to which Indigenous understandings and epistemologies relating to the responsibility to protect have been assaulted and driven underground by the state and the violence of settler structures. For MMIWG families, self-determined ideas about R2P centered on Indigenous understandings of power, place, and community, evidenced by so much of our testimony and through themes like culture, health, human security, and justice, traditional and contemporary community stories showed us how women, girls, and Two-Spirited people fight to protect themselves and others from violence, either in a literal, physical sense or in other forms. For many as well, the state's right R2P was not only directly linked to acts of violence, but to an overall respect for and upholding of basic human rights, indivisible from the notion of protection in a purely physical sense. For example, many talked about Indigenous women's right and access to healthcare or the access to justice, which didn't necessarily imply an act being committed, but as one of the panelists already mentioned, constituted many crimes of omission. As a national inquiry, our vision was always to help build a foundation for Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirited people to reclaim their rights as sovereign Indigenous peoples, to reclaim what they called their power and place. This is based on a common principle that we took to heart throughout the process and that we heard again and again. Our women and girls are sacred. This is not a place beyond human understanding, but a reflection of what every single life we heard about meant to each person that testified. Understanding why women and girls are sacred through various Indigenous perspectives is an important part of reconsidering R2P and what it means within the context of Indigenous communities. It's also a starting point, we thought, and we still think, to address some of the historical and contemporary negative relationships that incite violence or create harmful spaces for those who are so important. What roles and responsibilities do women, girls, and Two-Spirited people have? What happens in their communities when they are taken away? And how can understanding why women and girls are sacred in Indigenous terms and through Indigenous epistemologies help us understand as a society how to create new healing encounters founded on the stories that we've handed down for generations? Importantly for families and community members, and in closing, I'll just share that really the main idea was that solutions have to come from within. No one who testified was saying that communities were always perfect or that communities never had to deal with issues internally. But what they were saying is that the solutions to violence today still exist in communities, and they exist in the self-determined ways that we can empower communities to address some of these issues in their own terms. Thanks so much.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you to all of you for your wonderful interventions. And I'd just like to put a question in the first instance to Nadia here. There's been much talk about how COVID-19 is accentuating threats to the most vulnerable populations, and we've looked at that in a number of specific contexts over this series of video panels. How do NGOs and concerned actors address the multiple specific threats posed by the pandemic to Indigenous peoples, and what is the specific nature of these threats?
Thanks for that question, Thomas. It's interesting because Karine used the language of an epidemic when talking about the level of violence, sustained violence directed at women, girls, and two-spirited peoples in Canada. And Indigenous peoples. And when we combined epidemic levels of violence with an actual health pandemic, a global health pandemic, we really have a very, very troubling situation at a crisis point. And this is something that I and a Brazilian colleague who's also a federal prosecutor and who serves as a focal point for genocide and mass atrocity prevention in Brazil have written about recently in the context of Brazil, but this is not unique to Brazil. So what we're seeing in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic is even before it started, we were seeing a number of countries experiencing democratic backsliding. Experiencing a number of threats to the democratic institutions and the rights of individuals and media organizations and civil society organizations to participate fully and to voice their opposition to government policies. And now when this occurs also in the context of a global pandemic, we see it being manipulated and utilized by leaders, in this case, in the Brazilian case, by the Bolsonaro administration, to take advantage of the media and the public attention being directed elsewhere, to the pandemic, to the health concerns of the pandemic, to institute even more dismantling of democratic institutions. So that's one of the things that happens. And in Brazil, this has been very explicit. There have been viral videos circulating of the Ministry of the Environment saying, hey, everybody at a minister's meeting, while everybody's looking the other way, literally using that language, we can get more projects into the Amazon and nobody will notice until it's too late. So we have this democratic backsliding being accelerated. We also have, so we talk about in the realm of risk assessment and mass atrocity prevention generally, we talk about triggers or accelerants or events that will push a country over the edge and initiate mass violence, and COVID can act in that way. It allows people are at such a state of anxiety and tension and frustration with stay-at-home orders, with restrictions on economic activity, that they're looking for someone to blame. And that is often one of the early stages in a mass atrocity, is we find a group to blame. And Indigenous people become an easy group to blame. Again, I'll use the Brazilian context because they are already an other. They're already treated as and thought of as a group that is quite distinct and quite different. And then if they can be portrayed as this group that is the barrier to economic development, which is defined as developing the Amazon and deforestation, then that comes into play. We also have the actual health effects. The virus is devastating Indigenous populations who often have very poor quality health care. And don't have access to the healthcare that they need. So you combine all of those things together at a time when The international community is looking more inward and less outward, and it's thinking only about themselves and not about how do we look out for our neighbors. It's a really, really toxic combination that is very troubling for Indigenous populations.
Yeah.
Did you like to add?
Sorry, I was going to say if I could just add to that, so good timing. I think in Canada there are many of the similarities that exist, but what we've seen that's really interesting is how the pandemic has really exacerbated many of the things that we pointed out in our work for the National Inquiry in terms of the lack of services and the lack of supports available, particularly in more remote communities. We're also seeing, because of social distancing and because of the pandemic, many safe spaces like shelters or refuges for women who are particularly fleeing domestic violence, not in operation or with limited services. And so it's really making a lot of things that are already really difficult in community worse. I would say too, in Canada, many Indigenous people suffer from sort of intergenerational legacies of chronic health conditions due to colonization that have been worsened or are more threatening under the veil of pandemic. And then lastly, I would say that the pandemic has sort of reshifted priorities, I think, for the government in a way that's not necessarily positive. For example, our report, including 231 recommendations, was released on June 3rd, 2019. And we asked the government to have a national action plan in place by June 3rd of 2020. It didn't come out and it didn't happen. And part of the reason that was given for why it didn't happen was, in fact, the pandemic. I understand that there were challenges, I think, for many of us that worked on the project who did so within a limited time frame and who talked to thousands of people. That wasn't a good excuse. We felt the work should have been done, could have been done, should have been pushed forward. But it's an example of some of the realignment that's going to happen. And as Nadia mentioned, also some of the economic projects that will be pushed through in the name of this recovery effort, economic recovery, that threaten to really trample on the rights of Indigenous peoples and really threaten communities in a really very real and concrete way.
Thank you. And, I'd like to ask India about if she'd like to comment on the notion of sovereignty. So a foundational idea of R2P is the notion of sovereign responsibility, which can also almost be seen as a movement towards the sovereign individual in the liberal tradition. And how does this idea transfer onto the sovereignty claims, or how should this idea transfer onto the sovereignty claims of Indigenous groups? Oh, I think you're muted, sorry.
Sorry, just to backtrack a second, I just had a little point to make too on the COVID. Is that an interesting comparison, again, looking at the discrimination of actually who's, in a way, who's considered to be sovereign or have like nation to nation, state to peoples, etc. relationships. And just to look at, you know, here where I am in the EU or in the Nordic region, states are have been helping each other out at times and providing supplies or even, you know, some medical spaces on other sides across the borders here and there. Whereas for Indigenous peoples and a lot of the peoples that I'm connected with, they're left without resources, without even the resources that the state encompassing is supposed to be providing or has said that it would provide, and it has been instead withholding or delaying, etc. So it's just another assault on what should be, you know, government to government relationships, and especially when there's non-recognition. So anyway, I just wanted to kind of have a comparison there. But in regards to sovereignty, the notion of sovereignty, I mean, I think the way that I like to look at all of this is that there, in the Indigenous model, there's the collective, there's the individual, but there's also the collective. And it's a very like real natural model, right? There's sovereignty of the state, but we're also a collective. There's sovereignty of indigenous peoples. And the way that I work, going back to what I was talking about before, is to look at specifically the body, and also in the context of the people, or in a governance group body, and look at, if I start at a point of looking at, for example, consent and rape laws, or domestic violence and root causes versus expecting someone to just report. And then taking that a step further and looking at the collective responsibility to historical redress and indigenous issues versus the sovereign responsibility. You know, for me, it's just a matter of respecting equally the individual, the collective, whatever the governing structure is, both as sovereign and a part of the larger collective. So I don't know if that answered your question, but yeah, just to equalize this, and a lot of times that can be seen in the inequalities can be seen in the laws themselves or in the methodologies, whether it's in the state or so.
Green, did you want to get in quickly on this one before we get to the questions from the audience?
Yeah, really quickly, I just wanted to add to that I think that one of the things that's often sort of cited when talking about Indigenous communities and liberalism is this real separation between community and individual. And I know, speaking from my community and the experience there, that these are really linked. In fact, like, the community enables the individual freedom. You're free because you have rights and responsibilities in your community. And so separate from the community, they don't exist in a vacuum, essentially, right? I think that's really interesting to sort of grapple with and think about how, in fact, when we tend to talk about Indigenous rights, we always say, oh, but Indigenous people are really about the collective. Like, we are, but we're about the collective because the collective enables me as an individual to pursue what I want to pursue freely, right? It's part of my right. It's also part of my responsibility to the community to do that for others. And then the other thing that I would add very, very quickly, because I know we want to get to the other Q&A, is that one of the things that I think is really interesting in thinking about sovereignty and thinking about these questions is to look at self-determination. We often talk about self-determination as a space of possibility, right? Look at all the things that are possible to do when you're self-determined. But I think self-determination, in fact, like, exposes the limits. Sovereignty exposes the limits of self-determination in a way. Because when you're self-determined, you're still not necessarily sovereign. And so you may have domestic nations within these larger states that are considered to be self-determining, right? We have many self-determination agreements in Canada, and comprehensive claims and territorial claims. But in fact, when you're starting to think about sovereignty and thinking about R2P, it really exposes the limits of self-determination and the need for self-determination to sort of like stretch further and do more for communities.
Thank you. And so now we're turning to the questions from the audience, and I think Nadia can have the first response to this one. It's from Carolina Comanduli, and the question is, how effective can UN mechanisms be, including the R2P, in preventing genocide and atrocities against Indigenous peoples, particularly in a place like Brazil? The Brazilian government regularly receives recommendations from the UN about not complying with their commitments in relation to Indigenous peoples' rights, but tends not to follow them. Is there a consequence or a sanction which could effectively stop the continuation of such violations?
Yeah, good question. Thanks, Caroline. There actually is, there has is evidence that has been presented in the last couple of weeks to the Office of the Prosecutor of the ICC from a group of human rights organizations in Brazil on behalf of Indigenous people regarding incitement to genocide by President Bolsonaro and other members of his senior administration team. So if there were action to be taken, then perhaps that could have some teeth to it, because that could actually punish the perpetrators. But no, what we've seen repeatedly is that the mechanism is not working, that the international community is not stepping up despite tremendous evidence. There are some small positive signs domestically. So just last week on July 8th, a justice of the Supreme Court in Brazil ruled on emergency measures to protect Indigenous people. The case was specifically regarding COVID-related risks to Indigenous people. And in the claim that was filed by the federal prosecutor's office on behalf of Indigenous peoples, they made reference to genocide as a historical and ongoing occurrence for Indigenous people. The decision by the judge didn't make reference to genocide, but the fact that he ruled so quickly in a matter of just a couple of days, and only gave a couple of days for the government to respond. So they have to form a kind of an emergency response team and start implementing strategies to keep people off Indigenous lands, to test them before they enter, to not permit entry without approval of Indigenous peoples, suggests that at least this judge recognizes the severity of the problem. But the international mechanisms, including R2P, have not functioned. There isn't enough teeth behind them to make countries really feel like they need to be attentive. So that puts more pressure on domestic Pillar 1 successes, which are then have to come in some respects from the grassroots.
Did you want to respond to this one also?
No, I agree. I agree with what she's saying. And I mean, I wouldn't get into any specific sort of cases or situations discussing the legalities without being actually like in consultation with the people involved. But yeah, I agree with what Nadia is saying. That's right.
Yeah. And this next question is addressed to all of the panelists. So perhaps Kareem might want to take this one first. It's from Christina Borelli, and the question is, what concrete steps or actions would you recommend for advocacy groups working in Venezuela with Indigenous peoples who are currently being abused by the Maduro regime in southern Venezuela, specifically in the context of illegal mining?
Yeah, I don't want to pretend to be an expert on Venezuela. I'm not. I can tell you what I know about from communities in Canada, and I think that can maybe give some sort of response to this. In terms of concrete steps, I think it's really important, and it sounds really mundane, but to document impacts and from within the community. For us, when we worked with family members, it was really important for them not to position what they had lost against international instruments or against sort of external and state-imposed sources of loss, but against what was happening in the community, what was changing in the community. For people that participated in the inquiry, participating in that process was a concrete step. For many, sharing that truth for the very first time was a very concrete step that they were able to take. And so the sort of participation in a formal inquiry process, though, was something that built on many grassroots efforts to raise awareness on this issue for a really long time. And so the inquiry was really not sort of the start of the process, but it was really like the culmination of all of these grassroots people working really, really hard to raise the profile of this, not just at home, but also internationally. And so we've had a number of Indigenous women's groups and also allied groups from the legal community working for a very long time to bring these issues into the international forum. In fact, to place pressure on the state to do something about it. And so those are some of the steps that like our family members have taken in terms of, you know, documenting their loss, but also looking outwards to see, you know, how can we raise the profile and the pressure on this state to, you know, either be pressured to do what's needed to address these issues, or to do what's needed to address the issues for being in violation of international law.
Thank you. And I'm looking at the time, and we've got one particularly interesting question to still get to. So I hope Nadia and India could forgive me if I don't directly come over to you for this one. Perhaps if you can fold your answer into this. And so this question is from somebody we all know very well, Max Pensky, also from the Institute for Genocide and Mass Atrocity Prevention, who we were fortunate enough to have on a previous panel. And he's asked if each panelist could identify a promising development, emerging actor or mechanism, or another potential high point that would let us think of how R2P can be operationalized in the protection of Indigenous groups better. So I suppose he's saying, what is the, where is the promise? What's the hope for the future? I suppose it's appropriate to let Nadia have first response to her colleague.
Okay, thanks, Max. Nice to know that you're listening and watching. So actually, I think the case that Corinne talked about in Canada is a starting point for hopeful signs, and in the sense of not only how that it's been handled, but that it is a model that can be copied elsewhere and hopefully can start a process of what we refer to as kind of social norming. We often talk about social norming in the context of individuals, and the Dangerous Speech Project talks about it in terms of how you can norm more inclusive language rather than dangerous language, but it can also be in the context of international and domestic behavior. And so if Canada is receiving, as I think it is, a lot of positive international as well as domestic attention for the national inquiry process and the report, hopefully that can send signals to other countries that they too can undertake these kinds of serious commitments to looking at what they have not done or what they have done and what they could do. So that's one place. The other is that we're starting to see some emergence of what are referred to as national mechanisms, which are more holistic approaches to atrocity prevention rather than just having the responsibility in one entity or another of government. And so this is something that the Auschwitz Institute pioneered in terms of tracking the development of national mechanisms. Our institute is taking on that process moving forward, keeping an eye on those. They're all still in very early nascent stages, but they have the potential to be pillar one focused entities within countries that could look across upstream, midstream, and downstream prevention, and therefore could be a more appropriate response mechanism for Indigenous peoples, because they would be more holistic across government.
Thank
Thank you. And India, what would you respond?
Yeah, I think I agree, and I think that the development, these are really interesting times, especially for truthing processes and truthing commissions, and it's becoming more and more common. And I think as that experience and these processes and these are further developed, that will feed back into the R2P, that will change the nature of how and who and when and what and why R2P is. And maybe that can be a part of the dialogue in these truthing processes also.
Final word. Corinne.
Sorry, I was having trouble hearing you. Yeah, I just want to say that even though I was very critical of the government of Canada before, one of the things I've recently become involved in the last month is the creation or the co-creation of a national action plan. So one of the foundations of the creation of this plan is to do it in collaboration with the Indigenous organizations and also the grassroots, but also family members and survivors. And so there's a very large table or series of tables where many of us meet on a weekly basis and sit and talk together about what this plan should look like and how it should be defined according to the communities themselves. And so instead of it coming from a place of sort of band-aid solutions and just funneling more money or funneling, you know, a few nice words at it, it's actually what they're working to do is to have it rooted in community. And I think that's a really promising sign. It might take a little bit longer, but that's okay. I think ultimately it'll be stronger for it.
Well, thank you all very much. It's now time to bring a close to this video panel on Indigenous peoples and their responsibility to protect from the Centre for Geopolitics. I would like to thank all of our audience, in particular for your many interesting and thought-provoking questions. And I thank again our panelists, Nadia Rubai, India Reed-Bowers and Corinne Duhamel. Please do check back shortly on the Centre's website at www.cfg.polis.cam.ac.uk, where the video of this discussion will soon be available. And this panel draws our series on responsibility to protect and mass atrocities prevention to a close for this term. Over the last few months, we were fortunate enough to host 10 excellent discussions on a range of important and pressing topics. And I thank all of our audience and all of our panelists. We'll be back in the new academic year with another series of panel discussions on R2P and the prevention of mass atrocities. And I hope that you can join us again then. And so from all of us at the Centre for Geopolitics, thank you very much and goodbye.